folks. We're talking about experimental fiction today, and especially as it applies to contemporary fiction. So, as we go through this talk, I want you to be thinking about what's happening in literature right now, what you are going to add to your literary moment in history, and probably a big part of that is going to fall under this umbrella term of experimental fiction. The two readings that we just had from Bonnie Jo Campbell and from Matt Bell certainly exemplify what a lot of editors would call experimental fiction. However, this has become kind of a big, messy umbrella term, and not everybody likes it. One of those people who doesn't like it is the editor of our literature textbook, Michael Marchione, who's a fantastic fiction writer himself, and he thinks that this term just gets tossed at anything that doesn't fit into a linear, traditional, realist story. And he has his own oversimplification, perhaps, of how we might think about contemporary literature. But he makes a quadrant that I think is useful to consider. So we have, on the top half, we have real and irreal, and that's speaking about the subject matter, the representation of things, of your characters and of the world, and then linear and nonlinear. And he says that rather than calling a story experimental, we might just think about it in these terms. But think about like the Index story by Matt Bell. It's realistic for the most part. All of that stuff could really happen, although surely it's completely nonlinear. Likewise, I'd say Bonnie Jo Campbell's story, realistic in subject matter, but non-linear in the structure. And then think of like Vampires in the Lemon Grove. We have a linear story being told in a pretty straightforward narrative style with irreal subject matter. Or Donald Barthelme, too. We could probably say that would be linear yet irreal. Sea Oak, same thing, would fall into this linear and irreal category. What about something like Stuart Dybek, though? Would we consider that a realist piece in a non-linear style because of the reflective nature? It goes back and forth, it jumps around the scenes. Yeah, probably it would fall into that category. Although, would I call Stuart Dybek an experimental fiction writer? I wouldn't. I think he's pretty traditional. So this is where I think Martone's definitions here, distinctions to make about experimental fiction, become really important. Rather than just like calling anything that's not traditional, linear, realist narrative experimental, we might think about it with a little more specificity. So it may be helpful to think about contemporary literature and what's happening in this moment. We have to think about the last clearly marked literary period, which would be postmodernism. And a lot of literary critics and historians would say that would be marked by World War II, and especially the atomic bomb, which would have been dropped in Japan in 1945. So the horrors of that war are responded to in the postmodernist movement. And very much the postmodernists come from a viewpoint of literature and writing about a world that has gone mad, a world that's forever broken apart and can never be fixed. And they speak to the modernists who would have been writing in the 1900s. 1922 was like the big hallmark year for James Joyce and T.S. Eliot and Virginia Woolf producing some of their most famous books. So those are big names with the modernist movement. But the modernists were seeking to make everything experimental and new, with the idea that by breaking everything apart, you could fix it again. So postmodernists, I want to note, are different in that postmodernists admit there is no fixing things, so we might as well have fun playing in the destruction. And I think that postmodernists get a bad rap. Personally, they're my favorite. It's my favorite literary period. And I think, they're funny. I think there's hope in this message. I think too often the postmodernist authors get seen as cynical and dark and bleak, and I don't think that's the case at all. In fact, I think They're more honest and open and joking about perhaps the reality of the world as it exists. The modernists, in fact, take everything so dang seriously. So some hallmarks of um, postmodernism that we might want to keep in mind, or that might be useful. Um, I have, created this circle here up at the top. Fragmentation and nonlinear narratives are going to be a very hallmark component of that. And a lot of this, you'll see these components will have pushed over into contemporary experimental literature and could be seen in things that were like Matt Bell's story and Bonnie Jo Campbell's story and some of the other contemporary things we've read. But that fragmentation is going to be marked by flipping through pages and there's just tons of white space. The story is not necessarily going to be told A to B in a straight line. It's going to jump around, and this speaks to, again, that fragmented, broken nature of the world that the postmodernists are very comfortable in playing in those kind of ashes of destruction. Also, you're not going to get resolutions with the postmodernists very often. They're pushing against this idea that there can be a neat and tidy untying of the knot at the end of the story, and instead are embracing, the lack of resolution ever being a possibility. And I think we even see this in contemporary literature, um, even in traditional realist pieces. Still, we're going to see this holdover of messy endings. Think of How Far She Went. There's that nice moment where the granddaughter is touching grandmother's dress, or almost touching, but we're not getting like they hug, they embrace, happy ending, the end. We don't get those kind of neat and tidy wrap ups in contemporary literature mostly at all, and that again speaks to the postmodernists. Metafiction is going to be another big hallmark of the postmodernist movement. So when we talk about that, that's like the narrator breaking the author often breaking the fourth wall to address the reader directly. Think of Dennis Johnson at the end saying, "And you ridiculous people, you expect me to help you." Those kind of moments are big in postmodernism, and a lot of it is about like taking authority away from the author. This idea that like we speak truth, we have full knowledge. This idea of omniscience, the postmodernists are saying it's all absurd. Like nobody has a truth necessarily that's better than anyone else's. So they're going to have a lot of fun addressing the reader, making the reader aware that they're reading. And again, Matt Bell's piece, Bonnie Jo Campbell's piece speak to this. Even the fragmentary nature and the borrowed form make you aware that you're reading a piece rather than being able to suspend your disbelief and think these things really happened. And then, so this mix of low culture and high culture, I think, is maybe my favorite part of what the postmodernists brought to literature. So they kind of said, let's stop, drawing these lines of this is literature, this is fine art, this is serious, and this is just play and entertainment and pop culture. They wanted to marry these two things together. And we, now there's a term called slipstream that embraces literary and popular genre like fantasy or horror together. Karen Russell would be a great example of this, bringing in vampire monster stories into a very literary work. Also, though, the postmodernists were interested in bringing in all the language that surrounds us in our everyday lives. So they would use advertisements and comic books, political speeches could be a part of a literary work as well. So all of this, they're interested in mixing all forms of storytelling and language together to form perhaps a more honest version of literature. And I have off to my side over here a Tralfamadorian from Kurt Vonnegut's novel Slaughterhouse-Five, which was published in 1968. It was the first novel to ever have the F word in it. The FCC had just recently lifted the ban, and even that, like the use of vulgar language, swearing like that, would be a part of this mixing of high and low culture. Also, as an important word to keep in mind is pastiche with the postmodernists. So rather than that would be like emulating, echoing, borrowing a style of somebody else. Like writing an alien sci-fi narrative into your literary novel. But whereas perhaps earlier movements would only do that if they were going to make fun of it or satirize these literary movements, pastiche more is an honor, an ode to it, uses and replicates this style for its own purposes. And again, it's all about embracing. Fabulism is a fun term that becomes a bit of an umbrella too to talk about the irreal. So some people equate magical realism with fabulism, or any kind of magical elements in a story could be called fabulism. It's actually a very specific term coined by Robert Scholes, a literary critic, and he says that the postmodernists were going back to an old fable style of storytelling. And it would seem very much like you were going to get a moral, like reading an Aesop or something like that. It seems like the postmodernists, and when you're reading Vonnegut, you can feel this. Like, it feels like you're getting a certain moral, and then by the ending, you get that messy, that hallmark messy ending, and no clear message to go by. Think of the Amelia Gray piece, The Darkness, that felt very much like an Aesop fable. But what's the moral, the takeaway? She doesn't feed it to you very neatly. So fabulism can be a lot of fun to work with, and again, it's a lot about breaking expectations. And then black humor is a big part of postmodernism as well. So my Tralfamadorian friend over here has the saying that gets repeated all throughout Slaughterhouse-Five, so it goes. Anytime anyone dies in that novel, or a fly dies, or even the champagne has lost its bubbles and has died, Vonnegut says, so it goes, right after it. And so this would be, an example of making humor a very dark subject matter. And Kurt Vonnegut and Joseph Heller and Thomas Pynchon, authors like that, would very much embrace this sense of humor. And I think we see that today in authors like George Saunders, of course. But think of even our pop culture, how much we've embraced this really like dark and demented sense of humor. And we could probably largely thank the postmodernists for their brutal honesty and bravery in doing this. And then finally, irony. You're going to get a lot more unreliable narrators. Even your third-person narrators, you probably can't trust in any kind of like overall sense of being. So I was just talking about the hallmarks of postmodernism and hoping to get you like thinking about what's happening in literature today in response to this literary movement, because we are working in a tradition, and we're always bolstered by what authors have done before us. So think about what the postmodernists have given us, and then how we might innovate. I will say we're at a very exciting time in contemporary literature. The very weird experimental stories like Matt Bell's Index story is getting published right alongside very traditional realist tales as well. Things like Vampires in the Lemon Grove, like, monster stories and sci-fi lit and horror lit is getting published in the New Yorker, just as well as, very traditional straightforward pieces. So we're not, I think maybe we're at a very open period in literature, perhaps. And if we were having a class discussion, I always like to ask, what's unique to our literary moment, to you in your storytelling especially. And I wrote down a bullet pointed a few things that have come up in class before. Perhaps we're embracing fragmentation even more, and that might be because of how we communicate through text messages. We're much more comfortable with asynchronous communication that doesn't happen in one time period, but could be stretched out over years of emails or Facebook messages, social media comments. How we communicate is certainly much more fragmented. And altogether, the language and culture of the internet too, surely that's going to seep into our literature. Yeah, I'd ask you to think about texting language as an interesting problem. For many years, I tried to avoid it. I had teachers who said, like, we don't want any texting language or like internet language in our story. But I would say now, like, how could we possibly tell a story of our time period without including these elements. And I think they're interesting problems for us to try to solve with language and story. And then, if the modernists are responding to World War I and the postmodernists are responding to World War II, how about our wars? Most of you have all been born in a war that's been ongoing, up to this point, or there's always been a war in some sense. And think about how those wars are so much different from the previous ones, in very far away countries, spread out into, kind of unclear situations. And doesn't that create a different kind of consciousness about war? And things like that on a much more global scale, perhaps, and much more fragmented. And then think about what terrorism has done for us as a culture as well. Our collective consciousness. Again, 9/11 would have happened probably very early in most of your lives, so you were kind of born with this new normal. But I would say that's definitely also influenced our culture and perhaps our stories. I wrote Walmart realism on here, and that's in response to a term from the 80s literary critics gave to writers like Raymond Carver and some of these other working class realist writers. And Kmart realism spoke to like a very gritty sense of working class, poorer characters where name brands like popped into the story, because I would certainly agree, like working class literature has to be thinking about like, the name of the beer you buy and the fast food restaurants you go to and your name brand of cigarettes. Like all of this stuff I think is pretty key to working class populations. The name of the products that you create and the job, the company where you work at. So the critics called that Kmart realism, and it was very much like a gritty sense of realism. So I would ask, and critics have asked, like, are we in a stage of Walmart realism? It's a different kind of consumerism than that Kmart moment. I'd say it's weirder, right? It's weirder. It's bigger than Kmart ever was. Or what about like Amazon realism, like where we are so inundated with brands and then with review culture, with our shopping experiences have become so odd. And I'm creating this video that I hope I'll only be using once for this one class. But we're in a moment right now with the coronavirus where we're trapped in our homes, and shopping all of a sudden has become even weirder. So I'd say these elements of modern consumerism affect our culture, and so they should affect our story. These are opportunities for us as writers to respond to and to take hold of our literary moment. So I'd encourage you to continue to think about that. What are you going to add to the literary tradition? What does your moment of literature look like, and how will you innovate? And I think it's always a pressure on us, a responsibility, perhaps, a duty to innovate, to push literature forward. Thank you for listening.